Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Israel Dialogues. I'm Rabbi Zachary Goodman. It is my honor and privilege to be with you again this afternoon. We have a wonderful program planned for us today, so I won't take up too much time. Just a few housekeeping items. So first, at the bottom of your screen, you will see that you have a Q&A function. I'll ask that should we have time for addressing questions from the audience, that you will please pose your questions in the Q&A function. And we should plan to be together for about an hour and a half today, ending right around 1:30 Eastern. So at this time, I'm going to invite Professor David DeWitt to set the stage for us and what we can expect for the next hour and a half together. Again, thank you very much for coming, and a special word of gratitude to Helena and David Fine, as well as our promotional sponsors, for making this webinar series possible. David, thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rabbi, very much. It's really a pleasure to welcome everyone back to the Israel Dialogues, and in particular to this session with Professor Meir Litvak from Tel Aviv University. As you will have noticed in the brief bio that's on the Israel Dialogues website, Meir is a scholar of Iran. He's a professor in the Department of Middle East History, and his research focuses on modern Iranian and Shi'i history, modern Islamic movements, and Arab anti-Semitism. He's widely published. His most recent book, which came out in 2021, is titled Know Thy Enemy: Evolving Attitudes Towards Others in Modern Shi'i Thought and Practice. And it's a real pleasure to have Meir back with us in Toronto, even though only via internet. It was a long time ago he came and spoke at the university when he was a visiting scholar at Cornell University. And I must say that it's a personal pleasure to be able to participate with him today. I first met Meir when I was a visiting scholar at the Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University in 92-93. And Meir had just a year or so before completed his doctoral studies at Harvard. So it's nice to have this opportunity. Finally, I'd say we're very fortunate because most of us, I think, have only a surface understanding and appreciation of the complexities of Iran as a state, as a people, as a nation, a deep history, its particular role in the Middle East, its particular role in Islam, which makes it stand out in so many ways. And this is an opportunity to unpack some of that, understand it better, and to appreciate Iran's current and possible roles in the Middle East in general, in international affairs, and specifically in the context of concerns around Israel and peace and security. So with that, let me turn over the screen to Meir, and we'll move on from there.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure. I will speak about Iran. With your permission, I will share with you a very simple, primitive PowerPoint presentation, which I hope will make things easier. Yeah, okay. Let me start about Iranian self-perceptions, which I think are very important in order to understand Iran's policies and Iran's behavior. And I would say that if you look at self-perceptions, there are two very interesting internal contradictions within the Iranian self-perception. The one is a contradiction or duality between, on the one hand, very strong sense that we Iranians were a great civilization going back 2,700 years ago with the birth of Zoroastrianism. We have a great glorious history going back again 2,600 years ago with the birth of the first Persian Achaemenid Empire. We are great. We have, again, great state, great civilization. We should be recognized as at least regional power. By the way, recently, one Iranian leader said, the US should recognize that Russia, China, and Iran are equal powers to the US. At the same time, with this self-perception of greatness, Iranians feel a tremendous sense of humiliation that they've suffered from the West since the early 1800s until, I would say, the Iran Revolution. The reason of this humiliation is that Iran was a buffer state between Russia in the north, the British Empire in the south. Both countries, while did not conquer Iran formally, certainly intervened in its internal affairs, exploited it viciously economically, and I would say again, humiliated the Iranians. So there's always this duality. We've been deprived of our rightful greatness because of the West. This is one element. Another very important element is Iran is a Shia state. A major feature of Shiism is the fight for justice. The Iranian state sees itself as the flag bearer of justice in the world against global oppression and injustice. At the same time, Shiism is the religion of the losers in Islam. Shia history is a history of persecutions, of humiliations, and it's also very, very strong, powerful within, I would say, the Iranian psyche. Now, add to that a third element, which characterizes the Islamic regime or the Islamic revolution, which is typical of many, I would say, radical religious movements. And this is, on the one hand, a major sense of threat from modernity, from modern Western, especially Western culture, that threatens our identity, our values, our religion in the short run. But in the long run, there's complete confidence that in the long run, Islam will prevail and Iran will be, or Islam led by Iran will take its rightful place in the world. And I think the Iranians always shift between these two contradictory feelings: greatness, humiliation, insecurity, and confidence in the long run. Now, another important point to look at is that modern Iran identity is based on, I would say, three complementary but sometimes contradictory pillars: Persian culture and ethnicity, the culture of the majority population, Shia Islam, 90% of the Iranians are Shiis, and the legacy of the Iranian state. And again, if you look at the Persian past, again, the sense of glory, of historical depthness. This is Persepolis, the capital of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus the Great, and so on. We're still admired in Iran by many people today. Even the regime has to accept his status. The other leg is Shiism, again, the religion of the oppressed, the religion which fights for justice. Shiism and Iranian identity have been enmeshed together since the 16th century. For most Iranians, an Iranian who is not a Shi'i is not a full-fledged Iranian, and a Shi'i who is not Iranian is in many ways a second-rate Shi'i. The Iranians cannot, I would say, hide their sense of superiority vis-a-vis other Arab Shi'is. When I did my PhD on 19th century Shi'i scholars, ethnic tensions between Iranians and Arabs were very prevalent, and you can still see it today. And the third element is the legacy of the state. Iran, unlike most other states in the Middle East, has a history of statehood. Iran has been reunified in 1501 by the Safavid dynasty. Unlike most other states in the Middle East, Iran has been a state in the past 500 years. It has a tradition of statehood, I would say a political culture of statehood, and a legacy also of diplomacy and so on. So if in political science we have the issue of stateness, then the stateness of Iran is very high compared to, let's say, other Arab states such as Yemen, Libya, and so on. Now, again, on the other hand, if you look at the Islamic Republic of today, I would say that the Islamic Republic is a dictatorship disguised as a democracy. It has participatory elements. You have elections, you have bodies that are being elected by the people, parliament, the president, municipal elections. But every elected institution in Iran is subordinated to an appointed institution, which is appointed by the supreme leader of Iran, the person who holds real authority in Iran. And let me give you two examples, okay? In 2013, there had been presidential elections in Iran. Over 608 people presented their candidacy. But there was a body called the Council of Guardians here, which has the right to authority to veto candidates, and they disqualified 600 out of the 608 candidates. The 8 candidates that were left were all men of the regime, all men who were loyal and to the UN regime. In the recent elections in 2021, even this was too much for the government, and they disqualified even people who were stalwarts of the Islamic Republic in order to make sure that current President Raisi, a hardliner, would win the elections. So we have the facade of elections, but in fact, the government makes every effort to ensure the correct results before the elections. And also, the president is not the person who conducts, who decides policy. He implements the policy decided by the supreme leader, who is a cleric, who is elected for life by, again, a clerical body, which supervises their elections. If you look at the history of the Islamic Republic, the idea of an Islamic Republic formulated by Ayatollah Khomeini was very much that the country would be ruled by a cleric. Historians equated Khomeini's ideas to Plato's idea of the philosopher king. What we have in reality is, I would say, that is after Khomeini died, the politicians have prevailed over the great scholars. Current Iranian supreme leader, Khamenei, is a mediocre scholar. He's been elevated. He was elected because he was loyal to Khomeini. 2 other greater scholars were assassinated in the early days of the revolution, and he was elevated to the leadership from being a fairly, I would say, middle-rank cleric. He has never been known for his scholarship, not even today, although he makes an effort to appear as a scholar. And he prevailed over such people. This is Ayatollah Sanei, one of the major clerics in Iran, more liberal, who has been later marginalized and almost put in house arrest. He died recently. So what we have here are the politicians, I would say, disguised as clerics, but they are more politicians than true scholars, clerics, or spiritual leaders. Now, Iran, even though it is a dictatorship, has never been a monolithic state. By the way, it's not a totalitarian state also, but it's never been a monolithic state. The Shia clerical establishment has always been driven by factionalism, even before the revolution, and such factionalism increased after the revolution when we began to have fights over policies, be it foreign policy or economics and social policies. In recent years, since the revolution, the political system in Iran, or the political arena in Iran, has been divided into 2 major factions, I would say. Hardliners and reformists. Reformists who are good Islamists who support the Islamic Republic, but wanted to take a somewhat different shape. The struggle between these 2 groups is over the nature and policies of the regime. Basic question is, should we preserve the status quo? Should we adhere to a very, I would say, strict, intolerant I would say, close interpretation of Islam, or should we try to reform the system? Should we be more attuned to the population? Should we try to modernize Islam in a better way in order to secure the regime's long-term viability? Both sides want to ensure the survival of the Islamic Republic. They disagree over the means to ensure this survival. For people like Khamenei, the reformists, and by the way, they use this term, are equal to the former Soviet leader Gorbachev. He thought he would preserve the system, but he destroyed the system because he undermined its cohesion. And Khamenei said, we will never allow repetition of Gorbachev in Iran. They used to call the relatively moderate President Khatami the Iranian Gorbachev. What are the issues that are at stake? The major issue is, should the regime be based on what is called absolute guardianship of the clerics? That is, that the system will be led by a cleric whose authority will be absolute, ordained by God, or what is the level of popular participation? Should we allow economic opening of Iran, especially to the West, or should we maintain what they call a resistance economy, an autarkic economy, or now let's turn eastward toward China or Russia and avoid opening Iran into the West? Should we allow Western companies to invest in Iran? Should we respect international law? Let me give an example. Iran refuses to sign an international agreement, a banking agreement, that where banks pledge to not to support terrorist organizations and not to launder illegal money. Iran says, we do not support terrorists, we support freedom fighters, and they refuse to open their books to international supervision. So they didn't sign this agreement, and they pay the economic price. Another issue is women's rights. How far should we allow women participation in the job market, or again, some personal freedoms, and also involvement in regional conflicts. A major issue here is who is the enemy? And again, every dictatorship needs an enemy. Every radical religious organization needs an enemy to maintain internal cohesion. And for Supreme Leader Khamenei, the enemy is very clear. It is the West and Zionism. They are the greatest enemies. Khamenei is a paranoid. Khamenei stated numerous times that the enemy is eternal, that the enemy is everywhere, the enemy is in every institution, every university, every office, every factory. You should always be aware, you should always be vigilant, and you should pursue the enemy at any time. At the same time, the former president, Rouhani, who was again a member of the regime, but a little bit more reformist, said in 2015 something audacious. He said, the enemy is not the US or even Israel. It's unemployment, inflation, cost of living, and water shortage and corruption. By the way, for this statement, he was accused of being a traitor. So again, this is an important point of issue of division. A major issue between, again, these two camps is the question of the compatibility or incompatibility between Islam and democracy. Or is the Islamic regime based on what is called intisab? That is, we are appointed by God, and therefore the people should have no say, or by intikhab, election by the people. The mainstream in Iran says Islamic democracy or Iranian democracy means democracy under the rule of the jurist. Real democracy means that the people voluntarily subordinate themselves to the supreme leader. Just as an orchestra, in an orchestra, every player obeys the conductor voluntarily, so is Islamic democracy. We all voluntarily obey the supreme leader. The hardliners, even more to the right, would say there should be no democracy under Islam. We have been appointed by God. The people should have no say whatsoever in politics. The reformists try to find a formula that would combine Islam and democracy. They believe, yes, we have been ordained by God, but without popular participation and popular support, the Islamic Republic will not survive. So they try to find some balance between the two. There was a small group of true liberal clerics who said can be no democracy under the rule of the clerics. All of these people who said so, by the way, have been either in prison or now in exile. None of them today is allowed to speak in Iran. Now, another point which I want to speak, if I want to shift to foreign policy, I would say that Iran is a rational state. Iran is not a mad state. And when I mean Iran is a rational state, I mean that Iran operates on a cost-benefit considerations or a cost-benefit analysis. Iran is also pragmatic, meaning here it is looking for the best way to achieve its goals. But Iran is not moderate. Pragmatism is not moderation. I think there is a major confusion very often in the Western media between moderation and pragmatism. Stalin was a pragmatist. He was not very moderate. And I will show you what I mean later by this. Now, if you look at, again, how Iran, its foreign policy priorities, and to prove my point, if you look at how Iran operates, you can see a clear set of priorities. The first priority of the regime is the survival of the Islamic system, of the Iranian revolution, or the regime, I would say, sorry, while preserving its revolutionary identity. Second comes state interest. Third comes Islamic ideology. Let me give you two examples. The Iranian constitution obliges Iran to support oppressed Muslim peoples. There is one such people near Iran called the Chechens, who tried to rebel against Russia and were suppressed brutally by Russia. What did the Islamic Republic of Iran say about Chechnya? It said two things. It expressed its pious hope that the Chechnya problem would be solved by peaceful means, and immediately added, we support Russia's territorial integrity, meaning we do not support Chechen independence. And the reason is clear. You have to be a complete idiot to go against Russia, your powerful neighbor, whom you need for the sake of the Chechens, who also happen to be Sunnis. Another example, by the way, is if you look more recently, Chinese oppression of the Uyghur Muslim minority. Iran denies that China oppresses Muslims. Iran justifies China policy because China operates against ISIS terrorists. So what China does against the Uyghurs is completely legitimate. And again, Iran needs China, so they look the other way when China oppresses the Uyghurs. The only two exceptions to these priorities are Iranian animosity toward the US and toward Israel. Why toward the US? Why does Iran call the US the Great Satan? Because for the Iranian regime, the US is the epitome of everything which is opposed or threatens Islam. The American culture, not Canadian culture, but US culture, is the epitome of godlessness, of materialism, moral, especially sexual promiscuity, and excessive individualism. In addition, the US exploited and oppressed Iran. The greatest danger that the US poses to Iran today, or one of the greatest dangers, is the temptation of Western culture that will pull Iranian youth away from Islam to the West. And this is why the US is Satan, because American culture is like Satan, which whispers. And by the way, in Muslim terminology, Satan is called the whisperer, al-waswas. The Satan whispers to us, follow, again, the American materialism instead of Islamic piety. The other enemy is Zionism, and it is based on two elements in Iranian ideology. One is Khomeini's perception or ideology of a Jewish war against Islam. Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, in his most important ideological book, The Rule of the Jurist, in the first page of this book, says that Islam was afflicted by the Jews since its inception. The Jews have waged a war against Islam since its inception. In modern times, Khomeini added, the Jews conspired with the West against Islam. All the sufferings of Islam in the past 200 years are the result of this joint Jewish-Western conspiracy against Islam. For Khomeini, Zionism was the culmination of the Western Jewish offensive against Islam. Khamenei added another element. Zionism is a satanic conspiracy to divide the Muslims, to dominate the Muslims. In addition, Zionism is the greatest moral injustice in modern history. In a letter Khamenei sent to European youth in 2017, he warned them against the perils of Zionism to Western culture and Western civilization. Again, because it constitutes injustice. What Khomeini argued, and what you can see and read in literally hundreds, if not thousands of publications in Iran, is a belief that the West and the Jews want to eradicate Islam. The West and the Jews want to prevent Islam from realizing its destiny to spread all over the world. This is, by the way, an Iranian caricature. I don't think there's need for much explanation here. Okay, I think it's self-evident. If you want another interesting caricature, is that Iran describes the radical Salafi jihadist organizations like ISIS and like Al-Qaeda as basically invented, created by Judaism, by the Jews. Okay, this is a caricature. It's called Wahhabiyat al-Saud Yahud. That is the House of Saud, the ruling dynasty in Saudi Arabia, is in fact was created by the Jews. In case you didn't know, by the way, the Wahhabis supposedly are descendants of Jews. Okay? So is the founder of ISIS, again, in case you didn't know, was an Israeli Jew, Shimon Elot. Okay? So what they argue basically is that radical Salafi jihadi organizations are all a creation of Americans and of Israel and are Jewish creations. Now, I argue, and I have worked on it, that what you see in Iran is not only anti-Zionism, but also anti-Semitism. Okay? Here are two caricatures published in Iran. Okay? And again, I don't think they need much explanation. Here it says Arbat Machtfrei, the famous writings in Auschwitz on Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Iran publishes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and many other anti-Semitic publications. Now, if you take all of these issues together, I mentioned a rational state, sense of threat, etc. How does Iran implement its policies? And here it is interesting, again, difference between self-perception and action. Iranians see themselves as being defensive. Iran is under siege. Iran is threatened by the West and by Israel. So what we are doing as Iranians is we are defending ourselves. But the way we defend ourselves is by being proactive, as I would say, by fighting the enemy in its own territories. I sometimes tend to equate it to Germany in 1914. 1914, Germany believed itself to be encircled by other countries. The solution to this encirclement was aggression, was aggressive policies. This is how I see Iran. How does Iran do it? By using proxies, by establishing militias in almost all our countries who serve Iran's foreign policy. The most important one is Hezbollah in Lebanon here. The Shia militias in Iraq, there is a Pakistani division, Afghan division, and the Houthis in Yemen all operate under the auspices of the Quds force of Iran. These militias do Iran's fighting, and I always like to quote a Saudi journalist who said that Iran is always willing to fight until the last drop of blood of the last Arab. Now, as I mentioned, Iran sees Israel as the greatest threat or the greatest enemy. Iran's idea is that Israel should not exist, but Iran did offer us a peaceful solution, which we rejected. Now, since 1990 to the present, Iranian leader Khamenei presented a peace plan, which he says we do not advocate throwing the Jews to the sea or exterminating them. What we offer is that there should be a referendum among the original authentic inhabitants of Palestine, that is excluding the Jews who came with Zionism, and they will decide by democratic means the fate of Palestine. Of course, they will decide that it will be a Muslim Islamic state because all Muslims want Islam. After this peaceful referendum, the Jews who came after the Zionist invasion will go back home. Small minority will be allowed to live under Muslim. Until Israel accepts this peace offer, and in order to make Israel accept this peace offer, our role as Iranians is to provide the Arabs and the Palestinians the means to fight and bleed Israel, bring it to its knees, so it would accept this peace offer. If you look at Iranian slogans, and when they say, and this is a popular slogan voiced every Friday in parades, Israel bayad mahshavad, Israel should be eradicated. I always say jokingly that when someone says that something should be done, usually they mean not by me, but someone else. That is, Iran will not eradicate Israel by itself. It will help others to eliminate Israel. Now, since 2003, after the ill-fated American invasion of Iraq and the toppling of Saddam Hussein of Iraq, Iran has established what they call the axis of resistance, that is a strategic political bloc composed of Iran, Iraq under Shi'i parties, Syria under the Assad regime, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and sometimes Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. This is a strategic bloc resistance against the US and against Israel. And again, to give you a sense of how Iranians see themselves, here I quote General Salami, the commander of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, who boasted in 2014, he said, in the past, we defended Iran from the Karha River, that is the Iran-Iraq border. But now our strategic border is the Mediterranean and North Africa. Okay? So we're defending Iran from North Africa. Okay? Similar expression of self-perception is this Hujjat al-Islam Yunusi, former Minister of Intelligence, who gave a speech about Iranian civilization, and he said, Iran was born an empire. Greater Iran, whose culture and civilization, religion and spirit stretches from China to the Persian Gulf. Okay, this is how he sees Iran civilization. But again, he said, we don't want to take the world, but we want to play a leading role in the world. Okay? And again, he added, we must think globally, but act locally. Again, this is how I view, this is how Iranians present themselves. Okay, we are a major power, and we should be recognized as such. Now, let me end by a few challenges that confront Iran, not right now, but I would say in next years. Okay, which I think maybe some of them may be existential challenges. First one is a demographic challenge. Iran has a very low fertility rate, very similar to Western Europe, because of women's education, high age of marriage, and very high rate of divorce. And the Iranians speak about it. They face a bleak demographic future, which let's say within 20, 30 years, they will have a very large layer of elderly people and not enough young people who will be able to sustain them. Problem number one. Problem number two is global warming. Now, I heard that you have now 15 degrees minus zero. Trust me, in the Middle East, we experience global warming. This is a sandstorm that result of global warming. This is a 2 kilometers high mountain of sand that is sweeping over cities. But projections in Iran speak about rising temperatures in southern Iran that will reach something like 60 to 65 degrees centigrade in the summer. Such degrees human beings cannot live under such heat, and that may mean mass migration of millions of Iranians from southern Iran northward. Again, a major threat. And finally, water crisis. Iran suffers right now from an acute water crisis, overexploitation of its water resources, and unless they invest immediately hundreds of billions of dollars in desalination, Iran will face a very bleak future regarding water. By the way, this is not what I'm saying as an Israel. I'm quoting official Iranian sources who speak about this threat. Now, let me end with one point, prospects of revolution in Iran. And I say that, unfortunately, I don't think that a revolution will come anytime soon, although I read an interesting article today of an internal document saying that the population is very agitated. But I think that there are three elements or three causes that prevent revolution from now. One is fear. The regime is oppressive. It is very effective in using oppression. And there's fear. Second, I think, is the fear of repetition of Iran of what happened in Arab countries following the so-called Arab Spring. And added to that, fear that we may get a regime which is much worse than the present regime. So right now, I don't think there is a likelihood of a revolution for major change, although I will add with one point, revolutions come as a surprise because all revolutions contain a certain psychological element that neither us as scholars nor the people themselves can predict, because no one knows how they will feel and act at a particular point in the future. Therefore, we can never predict revolutions. We can always explain them in retrospect. So I will end here and leave time for questions. I think I spoke too much anyway. So I now allow you to speak. I'm sorry, I will stop here.
Right. Let me get my video back. We're all set. Thank you so very much. That was fascinating. And start my video. I think I've started my video. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much, Amir. That was really marvelous. You covered an enormous amount of information and presented us with insights and understanding that I think are important to reflect upon. Just to start this conversation, one of the things that I took notice of in reading the two articles you provided was this ongoing effort within Iran to reach out to the larger Islamic world and create this notion of an Islamic unity, Islamic conference that they've been holding. And I take it that one of the principal instruments is the way it has tried to categorize the Wahhabi and the Salafi Jihadi Sunni as outside the realm of mainstream Islam, and that moderate Sunni and true Shia can in fact live and work and cooperate for a common good. If that's a fair rendering of one of the things you were writing, how successful has that actually been? I'm not aware of major breakthroughs. I see things happening on the side recently where Iran has been having meetings either in their capital or in another city, or going to Baghdad, or going certain places, but they seem to be reactive to changes that are occurring within the regional political world. And I'm wondering if it is evidence of their success in approaching the idea of a unified Islamic community, or if it's really piece by piece political pragmatism.
Well, I think that right now it is unsuccessful. They made tremendous effort again to build a common ground with mainstream Sunni Islam, but what happened with and now, by the way, you can say that in 2006, during the second Israel-Lebanon war, the Shias were very popular. Nasrallah of Hezbollah in Lebanon was very popular among Sunnis because he defied Israel. But since the Arab Spring, especially what happened in Syria, when Iran supported the Assad regime, who suppressed brutally Sunnis, who bombed Sunni cities, there's been great, not only apprehension, but I say resentment of Iran among many Sunnis, who argue that Iran has revealed its true Shi'i face. And therefore, Iran, I think today, is unsuccessful in trying to build this common bridge, not to also to mention that the Muslim world by itself is very fragmented today. The Sunnis in the Middle East are divided into at least two rival camps. One, I would say, Saudi-led camp. One is Turkey Muslim Brother camps. Certainly, Iran has failed, I would say, to build a common ground with all of them. It tries, but it's not successful.
Let me just jump for a moment then, specifically from the religious to one of the major Iranian instruments of impact, of the extension of their interests, and that's the IRGC. You mentioned the Quds Force. They've been engaging for quite some time, the Iranian state, in active interventions. To what extent is there evidence that the Iranian population still accepts that as part of the role of the Iranian state? Because I don't have the data in front of me, but I seem to recall recently reading that increasingly, and not just when the Iranians have gone to the street, but the Iranian population have been increasingly frustrated with the use of Iranian resources, finances, capabilities in these external adventures, while the Iranian people are suffering in terms of food insecurity, as you said, the water, the ecological challenges, the pollution, in which there seems nothing seems to be done. So is there a growing tension within Iran between those who see Iran's role and mission to extend itself in the region, versus those who see the importance of regaining a sense of sufficiency, self-sufficiency and capability in an Iranian state? Or does that clash with modernization questions?
I would say, I believe that most Iranians today would prefer to focus on domestic problems. You know, if you look in the past, whenever we had semi-free elections, again, they were never totally free, but when you had more latitude, reformist candidates won overwhelmingly. They usually got, you know, Khatami got 70% of the vote, Rouhani got 58% of the vote, or 61%. Most, you know, meaning most Iranians wanted to engage the world. By the way, you can see it in the, you can see satellite dishes on houses in Iran that you watch Western TV and so on. Now, we also saw during recent demonstrations, the slogans, no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, we only die for Iran. Which the regime invented the counter slogan, yes to Gaza, yes to Lebanon, we die for Islam. There were also indications that people, again, they may not be pro-Israeli, but they are either indifferent or they are angry again that Iran squanders its resources to fight everywhere and not domestically. There are such indications, clearly. Unfortunately, again, they are not powerful enough. And unfortunately, their vested interest in Iran. The IRGC is not simply an army. The IRGC today is an economic empire. It controls large segments of the Iranian economy. There are millions of people who benefit from the current system, economic and political system, that they therefore will support such policies. So even though the population at large may be either indifferent or, I would say today, disaffected, it's still not powerful enough to impact the regime's policies.
John or Mark? Do either of you have? Yes. Mark, and then to John.
I thank you very much, Professor Litvak. This was, as David indicated, a very interesting and informative presentation. I had actually two very different questions to ask. One has to do with the military, the Iranian military system and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and how strong it is. It seems to me that they have a complete lock or hold on Iranian society at this point, which would make it really difficult for any kind of, you know, groundswell, grassroots revolution from taking place. That's one. And the second thing is, if you could talk about sanctions and what impact sanctions have had, if any, on the Iranian regime.
Well, Iran has two armies. There's the regular army, which is called Artesh, and then there are the Revolutionary Guards, which are called Sepah. The Revolutionary Guards are the elite army. They are the ideological army. I would also say they have been a very important personal power base for Supreme Leader Khamenei, who had cultivated them for the past 30 years. The Revolutionary Guards have two roles. One is domestic control, and also, I would say, defending the country from the outside. They have, the Revolutionary Guards control the missiles. Iran has built a very impressive missile force, maybe something like 2,000 ballistic missiles of 3,000 kilometers range, 5,000 kilometers range. They are controlled by the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards also have an economic empire. Not only that they have the largest engineering company in Iran, Khatem al-Anbiya, which is the largest, but they also own numerous companies, factories, etc. So they employ, again, I would say hundreds of thousands of people. The Revolutionary Guards are about 250,000 people strong. But they employ around them, I would say, several more millions. In addition, by the way, the government implemented what you can say fictitious privatization, where they supposedly sold government companies, but who bought the companies? Trust funds of, again, groups that are loyal to the regime. So now these people know that their pensions in the future depends on the survival of the regime, and therefore they will fight for the regime. The Revolutionary Guards have a special force called Quds Force, which is responsible to spread the revolution outside Iran. Led by Qasem Soleimani, who was killed by the Americans, now by a person called Khani, who is not as efficient as Soleimani. And he coordinates, again, the militias from Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, etc. This is, I would say, in a nutshell about the Revolutionary Guards. If you look at the sanctions, The sanctions have been very painful, certainly to the population. I saw recently statements about the total erosion or destruction of the middle class, of growing discontent. We have seen in the past years mass demonstrations in 2019, which have been suppressed, but we see, for instance, all the time strikes by workers who don't get paid, by government employees who are underpaid, and so on. Again, they're still not sufficiently spread to pose a threat. But they are certainly painful. They've not brought Iran to its knees, partly because today China helps Iran, Russia helps Iran, Iran also smuggles oil through Iraq. So Iran has been able, I would say, to somehow circumvent some of the sanctions, but they are certainly painful. And one in Iran is anxious to, let's say, resume the nuclear agreement under its conditions because it wants the removal of the sanctions. So it's not that it is indifferent, but true, it is still manages to, I would say, survive or maintain the system.
John?
Thanks, Meyer, very much. A couple of questions. One relating to the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism that you talked about. Is it, do you think, shared generally by the population? And I guess you can split out anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. For example, do they buy into the conspiracy theories that Jews are responsible for ISIS, Jews are responsible for Wahhabism, et cetera, or is this, you know, a kind of propaganda that is useful, but not necessarily internalized? I mean, I've heard in the past that there isn't anti-Semitism in, you know, there's a lot of anti-Baha'i, there's other antis, but the Jews seem to, the few that are there seem to get along, or at least are not affected that much. So just your views on that. And I'd also be interested just in the connection between Iran and Hamas. Obviously, we've got Sunni versus a Shia and complications, but what effect are they having or trying to have, et cetera? Thanks very much.
Well, I would say it's very difficult to see or know how many people are being affected by anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Again, it's not a democratic country, don't have opinion polls. There are certain indications you can say. You can say on the one hand, no, most Iranians have been constantly exposed to anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist propaganda and to nothing else. So they don't really know much about Zionism and Judaism and so on. Now that can lead to two results. Some of them may buy what they've been told. Others who dislike the regime will probably say, well, if the regime says A, then I believe in B. And we have it. We have some indications. Many Iranians who met Israelis, you know, in outside Iran, tell them, don't believe that all of us hate you. You know, or, by the way, I think many of them don't care. And again, and some say, again, we don't hate you. Now, there's you can also speak about some anecdotal elements. I saw recently an interesting clip on YouTube. People were asked, who is the country they hate most? Surprisingly, Israel was not number one. I mean, some said Israel, but many said, you know, Saudis, of course, and others. So you have a long list of enemies, and we are one of them, but not necessarily by all. Again, number one by all Iranians. Now, the other regarding your second question,
Hamas.
Iran has been helping Hamas since its inception, or let's say since 1994. Iran has supplied Hamas with the technology, with the know-how, and before that, with actually, I would say, the hardware of rockets to attack Israel. Iran supplies Hamas with money. Now, by the way, who says so? Hamas leaders and Iranian leaders. I mean, the Iranians boast about it. Hamas leaders thank Iran about it. publicly. Iran has supported Hamas logistically, and Iran trained Hamas people. Now, at the same time, Hamas was always careful to say, we are not stooges of Iran. That is, we are happy to get UN help in order to fight Israel, but we are not subservient to or subordinate to Iran in its other regional conflicts. Let's say, unlike Hezbollah, who is, I would say, the long hand of Iran in the Middle East. And Iran seems to accept it. Now, there was some tension between Hamas and Iran in 2013, 2014 because of the Syrian civil war. There was tension, there was, I would say, even some anger. And ever since then, there's been an internal debate within Hamas, between, I would say, two groups. One says, apparently mostly military leaders, say, we should ally ourselves closer to Iran. And others say, no, we should not forget that we have to be part of the Arab world, and we cannot sever all our links with Arab countries. It will side with Iran. And I think this is an ongoing debate within Hamas. But there is certainly close cooperation between Hamas and Iran.
I have another question. If
Go ahead.
yeah. There's a kind of conversation about what should Israel be doing about Iran. There is the Bibi view that Iran is like Iran sees Israel, the great Satan, and we've got to focus our attention on that. This is the enemy, get Israel fired up about this, go to the UN, show the rockets. Others, me, for example, think that this is not particularly effective way to deal with Iran, that maybe lowering the temperature might be a better way. Maybe there is no lowering the temperature with the radical elements of Iran. And so I'm just, I don't want to necessarily move into the whole nuclear debate. I just want to get your sense of Israel, Iran, what is the best way to deal with a regime like this, which is undemocratic, autocratic, authoritarian, etc.?
Okay, let me say, first of all, to be honest, I've never been a supporter of Netanyahu, okay, and I dislike him wholeheartedly, so I usually don't support his policies. I think Iran is a major strategic challenge to Israel and a threat to Israel, but I think Netanyahu's policy has been mistaken, okay? Now, let me also say another point. Israel should not take the lead in the world effort against Iran, because then it makes us the immediate target of Iran. One thing. Another point, Israel, in my view, should not attack Iran, let's say, is a major military attack on its nuclear issues and so on. I think this would be a disaster for Israel. And I'm saying it as a concerned Israel. At the same time, I think that the current Israeli policies, for instance, when we try to prevent Iran from establishing military presence in Syria, or to open a second front against us from Syria, is a necessary, essential policy, even though it is only partially successful. Mm-hmm. There is a debate in Israel, should we, as someone said, should we only fight the nails of our enemy that is trying to clip its nails in Lebanon, Syria, or face Iran in its territory? I think, another point is that we should not make the Iranian people our enemy. If we'll attack Iran, we'll make the Iranian people our enemy. This would be a long-term mistake. We should try somehow to, I would say, try to win time. Because I believe that in the long run, the Iranian regime is going to face serious challenges or threats. Time is on our side. And therefore, if we try to gain time, I would say that will be more profitable vis-a-vis Iran.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questioners, and I will get to the written questions. We also have someone who she says she has a question that's too hard for her to write. So I'll let Rabbi Goodman manage her access in a moment. But before I do that, two rather different questions. One is the observation that this issue of modernity and Western approaches, Western life as a concern. And yet Iran has had a tradition, a rich tradition of cultural and learning institutions, and has sustained a very active university community. We had a series of Iranian postdoctoral students come to do research because they can't get access to the relevant documents, and the state has provided them funds to go abroad to study for a year. So it seems to me that's an indication that there is, at least I guess perhaps it's under caution or constraint, an effort to sustain the gaining of a broader knowledge base and the advancements, whether it's humanities or in the sciences and technology or healthcare. And I'm wondering if that kind of attention is just simply being well managed. Is it a problem because it could sow further the seeds of unrest and revolution, and so the universities are not nearly as open as they like to present? How important are they, given how important I think they once were considered?
Well, I would say that not only Iran, but many Muslim countries in the Middle East face what you can say the billion-dollar questions. How do you achieve modernization without Westernization? That is, how do you acquire modern science and technology without taking Western values along with them? Now, they believe that they can manage it. By the way, Iran has never been against science. On the contrary, Iran has invested huge amounts of money in advancing science and technology. By the way, made great advancement in recent years in science and technology. But they try, but again, without buying Western values. Now, for them, the model is, by the way, China. They regard China as the model to emulate. China, who has become a major world economic power without taking Western values. And they want to emulate China. Now, there is a problem in Iran among some people, again, who are attracted to Western culture. There's also another interesting, which I'll look at in a second, there's another interesting point. Iranians, unlike the regime, unlike the Arabs, translates Western political thought, Western philosophical thought, and translate it into Persian in order to debate it. Okay? For instance, they've translated Charles Taylor, okay? I think from Toronto, right? No, from Montreal.
Right.
They translate to Persian in order to argue with him. They translated Isaiah Berlin, Essay on Freedom, in order to debate with him. So they understand that you cannot shut Iran from Western thought. You have to provide scholarly, rational responses to Western thought. At the same time, there is a problem in Iran, and by the way, Iranians speak about, in recent months it has become even more urgent, of brain drain in Iran. They speak about a major problem of brain drain, young people leaving the country to the West because they can no longer stand, I would say, economic difficulties and also the suffocating cultural situation. So do they manage it very well? Depends, it's on the eyes of the beholder, I would say, whether it is good management. But this is what they certainly try to do. Again, separate science and values.
So let me turn to a couple of questions that have come in. This first one, I think you have at least partially answered earlier, but let me pose it to you. It's from an anonymous attendee. How effective are embargoes and boycotts against Iran? What is the attitude of the Iranian government and the people of Iran to these embargoes?
I think the sanctions have imposed great difficulties for Iran. And again, you could see two responses. Former President Rouhani believed that signing a nuclear agreement with the West would remove all sanctions from Iran, would enable Iran to open itself to the West. By the way, Supreme Leader Khamenei opposed opening to the West. He preferred Iran to be, I would say, poor but pure. Okay? if you look at current President Raisi, who is a hardliner, he always speaks about the need to remove all sanctions immediately, which means the sanctions are hurting. But again, he doesn't want to pay the certain price necessary for removing the sanctions. So I would say the sanctions are affecting Iran. Still, they believe they can muddle through, at least in the short run, until the sanctions will be removed. Now, what will happen if they last another 10 years? I don't know.
It's the only country I can think of that's gone through comparable sustained sanctions and continues to insist that it can manage and that it's better to suffer under the sanctions and be resilient and self-sufficient is North Korea.
Or Cuba.
Pardon me?
Cuba, maybe.
Cuba.
Also.
Cuba's had outlets with other countries. North Korea, really initially it was only China and Russia, the Soviet Union, and then it became only China. John?
Iran population is not the North Korean population.
No,
what the North Korean population can endure will not succeed in Iran. It's a different population, much more sophisticated, and I would say would not be willing to pay the price, which North Korean population maybe has no choice. So I don't think they can go as far as
are under much more authoritarian regime.
Yes.
John, you had a question.
Yeah, so we don't know what's going to happen, but if Iran does, and the United States and the other 5 do agree on a new JCPOA, what do you take away from that? So Iran is going to make a deal with the great Satan in order to lift these sanctions. Obviously, it in your analysis, it's sending a signal that the reformers or the practical calculation amongst the conservatives is that they need this now, because obviously they could walk away, continue with sanctions, and but there's hope, there's a possibility. So what is your analysis? Let's say there is a deal. What is the calculation going on there? Has somebody won or lost, or is this just, as you said, they're practical, they're pragmatic?
I think again, I believe again they're pragmatic and practical, in the sense that they want a deal. They want a deal. In order, I would say, to consolidate the regime. I don't think, by the way, that I would not want to speak too much about the nuclear issue, because you talk about it, but I'm not sure Iran wants to go all the way to the bomb. They may be very happy with what being a threshold state, okay, which gives them all the benefit without paying any price. What the current regime hopes that sanctions will be removed, and then Iran will be able, I would say, their slogan is to turn eastward, toward, again, China, Central Asia, as a replacement of the West. They believe that this will solve their economic problems, and again, will absolve or exempt the regime from threats of being open to Western culture. Now, whether or not it will succeed, I don't know. One problem that they may face is unmet expectations. That is, let's say sanctions are removed, people's hopes will rise. Okay, now we'll have some relief. I did not mention it, but Iran is an extremely corrupt state. Okay, 150 out of 180 in the global corruption scale. Very badly managed economically. So even if sanctions are removed, it's not going to be, Iran is not going to become a South Korea, okay, tomorrow. That may lead to, might cause problems, because people may be very disappointed. But on the other hand, you can say the regime can believe that it can get more time and consolidate itself even more.
Hey, let me turn to another question. What role do the differences in language, for instance, Arabic, Hebrew, English, etc., contribute to the misunderstandings among the various countries, especially the West versus Iran?
I don't think it's a problem of language. You have many Persian speakers in the US. I think it's a question of, I would say sometimes it's cultural blind spots, okay? For instance, Westerners sometimes don't understand, let's say the depth of Iranian anger, sense of humiliation, frustration, okay? One thing, or also sometimes Western naivety. All people want freedom, all people want democracy, okay? They don't really mean what they say. They can't be serious about what they say because no sane person would say such nasty things, okay? And also sometimes naivety that all problems have solutions, which is not wrong. In the Middle East, we know that many problems never have solutions. So I think it's not so much a question of language. It may be a question of, again, some cultural blind spots of both sides, by the way. Also, there's sometimes a tendency that we don't want to hear too much bad news. And we tend to, a friend of mine said, if you look at scholarship, for instance, there's much more scholarship about Iranian liberals, who are very nice, admirable people, than about the hardliners, okay, who are nasty, but much more powerful. Much less has been written about them than about the liberals. Okay? Maybe because we like them, we identify. I can't hear you. I think you're on mute. David, you're on mute.
Now I'm not.
Okay.
Now okay?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay. Amnon Zohar has asked the following. When you look at a map of where Iran is active directly or through its proxies, you see that access to the Mediterranean via Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, and the control of the Persian Gulf waterways, especially Bab el-Mandeb, and a land corridor through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon that encircles Israel and also Saudi Arabia. Is this a deliberate grand strategy or driven by the goal of exporting Islamic revolution and resistance?
Well, I would say for Iran, the Persian Gulf and Iraq are its two most important arenas. Okay? Syria and Israel and so on, I would say, are second after Iraq, in the sense that Syria has been always an Iran ally and is extremely crucial for Iran to preserve the Syrian government. It's also essential to preserve link with Lebanon, because in Lebanon you have a very important Shia community. Hezbollah has been, again, the long arm of Iran, and Israel has been a rival for Iran. So I think certainly it is a high priority of Iran to become what I will call hegemonic power in the Middle East. Again, they know that they cannot control the Middle East. Okay, they know that they're not going to occupy Arab countries, but at least they want to be able to dictate certain policies to other countries. And I think they want to turn Syria into, I would say, an Iranian not only ally but satellite. Again, let me give an example. During this war in Syria, some Iranian politicians said that if you want to defend Tehran, you have to defend Damascus. And they describe Syria as Iran's 35th province. So this is, you can say, again, is it sphere of influence or first a belt of or line of defense of Iran, or both? And the Saudis are a major rival. Again, you're on mute. No, you're on mute.
You have the opportunity for a whole lunch.
David, I apologize. We're getting some feedback on your end, so let's see the unmute in between.
That's okay. I'm getting some feedback from somewhere right now. Okay. Mark or John, do either of you have anything? Otherwise, I have a follow-up I'd like to ask about the regional politics. When I think, when I think back to what you wrote in your two articles, you did write about Iran as a regional hegemon and a regional power. In fact, in your opening remarks this afternoon, you talked about Iran seeing itself, a self-perception as a great power. But my sense is that traditionally, certainly in the Sunni world, it's been Egypt that has held sway politically and culturally. And Turkey more recently has again tried to make inroads in playing politics. But we haven't had yet a bit of a conversation about Iran and Egypt. And I'm wondering if there is something critical there in terms of constraining or in some ways affecting the ability of the Iranian regime to pursue its objectives.
Okay. Let me say, Egypt is a has-been. Egypt has a great past. It used to be a big power. Today, Egypt is a poor, second-rate country in the Middle East. It is poor. It depends economically on other countries. It doesn't have the power and influence and prestige it had in the past. Egypt fears Iran. It regards Iran as a strategic threat to itself. It is being offended by Iran repeatedly. And as long as the current regime remains in power in Egypt, likelihood of a rapprochement with Iran is minimal.
About Turkey?
Turkey and Iran, I would say, is love-hate relationship. Economically, they depend on each other. Right now, they share common antipathy toward the Saudis, but there are also some competition between the two. So it's some competition, but also mutual dependence, I think, together. And also Erdogan his erratic conduct has been able to alienate every leader in the Middle East. So Turkey today doesn't enjoy the same prestige and influence it had aspired to.
We just checked to make sure I haven't missed it. There's a new question that I'd like to share with you from Arnold Englander. What are the communications of the Iranian government to the public with respect to the proposed use of its existing nuclear power? That is it for prestige in the world and for peaceful use, or does the government convey to its own people that their nuclear power will be useful vis-a-vis its adversaries, in particular Israel?
Well, I'll say very briefly, I think Iran wants nuclear capabilities as for insurance against attacks. It is also impact of the trauma of the Iran-Iraq war, when we've been attacked by Saddam Hussein with rockets, missiles, and chemical weapons. It's also a symbol of the government's prestige. The Iran government denies it wants nuclear weapons. They claim they want it only for peaceful purposes and to prove Iran's technological advancement and technological position in the world. This is the message they convey to the people. And by the way, 99% of the Iranians support this policy. Of nuclear capability as a symbol of Iran's advancement and so on.
All right. Please mute background noise, right. All right, John, Mark, before we close the session, anything further? Then, Mayor, let me thank you very, very much. This has been fascinating. I just don't think we, certainly in Canada, have a deep and full enough understanding of Iran, either state apparatus, the political functioning of the regime, the various points of power and influence, and how it sees itself and how it sees threat and opportunity. And I think you've opened up that, and I'm very grateful to you, as I know many of our listeners are, because we have been getting comments of people who've had to leave and who've said that this has been fascinating. So thank you so much. And for those who are online, let me remind you that next week We have as our guest Seema Shine, who's one of Israel's leading experts on Iran and nuclear issues, and has had both research and senior government responsibilities in looking at the Iranian nuclear initiative and the ongoing talks. So that's kind of a natural follow-up to our session today. And following that, we're going to be looking at some of the broader issues on Middle East security with Asher Sasser. So we hope that you have enjoyed this and that you'll be back with us next week. And it'll be Thursday next week, not Friday. Thank you, Mayor, very much. And Mark and John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.